Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the top political stories of the day. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Doug Kroneisel, filling in for our host, Victoria Rose. Thanks for being with us. Today we're joined by Alexander Russo, the founder and publisher of The Grade. The weekly column and newsletter aims to support and encourage great writing about education and features roundups of the latest headlines, interviews with education journalists, special series about key issues, and much more. Over the course of his career, he's worked in education policy, founded a handful of different education news sites, and written for Slate, The Atlantic, and Chicago Magazine, just to name a few. So, Alexander, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, most definitely. And we were kind of talking before we jumped in that we have communicated about school board things in the past, albeit not in this medium. So I'm very much looking forward to continuing those conversations. Your career has taken a few really interesting twists and turns. Could you tell us a little bit more about your time working in education policy? Any really noteworthy or kind of exciting work that has stuck with you over the years on that front?
Sure. I spent about 10 years during the 90s working as a legislative aide or policy advisor to elected and appointed officials. This is basically Clinton 1 and Clinton 2 administrations. My first jump in was working for Dianne Feinstein, who was then, hard to believe it, but that was a new senator from California. And I covered education, health, and labor issues for her. There was a lot going on then around school safety, school meals, school discipline, things like that. And then I did a stint working for the New York City Board of Ed chancellor, who at the time was a guy named Ray Cortines. Back then, it was an independent elected position. And then I came back to D.C. and did a second stint with a guy named Jeff Bingaman, who was a senator from New Mexico. Mm-hmm. He was on the education committee. He was the number 2 or number 3 Democrat. He was on the education committee, which meant I got to be involved in appropriations, reauthorization, hearings, and all the rest. I tapped out in about 2000, a long time ago now, after doing those 3 stints in policy, and became an education journalist.
2000, that was right before the Bush era policy. I work at Ballotpedia, so I should just be able to rattle this off. No Child Left Behind. We got there. So you got out right before that was coming down the pike?
Yeah, those ideas were in development, but hadn't happened yet. So I saw some of them in development. I wasn't there for the bill signing, alas. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, a lot of things it was already clear then that things were going to slow down rather than speed up. And I was antsy to be in the fray or be where things were happening, and I thought I could make a bigger impact on the journalism side.
Well, I'm guessing that working inside the process of crafting policy is a really great background to have for reporting and writing the education beat, which tends to touch on a lot of topics that you don't typically hear talked about on a regular basis. So for those of our listeners who don't know what The Grade is, could you share more about what you all do and why you felt it was important to more closely examine kind of the coverage of education and get into covering education in that more journalistic lens? Sure.
Initially, when I moved over from policy work and politics to journalism, I thought that it would be really helpful, like you said, to have a knowledge of how policy and politics works. Not most education journalists don't have a political background. And indeed, it was helpful. It's like a superpower. If you know why someone's holding a press conference, why they're introducing an amendment, why they're putting out a report, if you know the political backstory or you can figure it out, that's definitely an advantage. But after about 10 or 15 years, I realized that I was increasingly worried about the coverage that I was seeing. Education journalists are hardworking, mm-hmm. well-meaning, brilliant, and most of them smarter than I am. But it's easy to fall into superficial, sort of cartoon coverage, good guy, bad guy, mm-hmm. Black versus white, sky is falling. I call it the tabloid education journalism. And meaning tabloid style journalism being practiced outside of the tabloids. I mean, the tabloids are going to do what they're going to do, and and that's fine. But I saw that spreading. So I switched over, started this thing called The Grade, because I thought that it would be interesting and helpful if there was someone holding journalists accountable the way that journalists hold school systems accountable. There are a handful, I didn't invent this idea, there are a handful of people and newsletters and organizations out there that watch journalism and try to hold journalism accountable for being helpful rather than toxic. But there was no one doing it with a particular obsession with education news. And I thought that I could focus in and help people understand what good education journalism looks like and what superficial or lazy or clickbait education journalism looks like.
Do you, in that like span of time from when you were writing about it to when you were now covering sort of the writing about it in general, how have you kind of seen the field of education journalism change? Has it expanded? Is it a bigger group? Is it mostly kind of like local beats and everyone's kind of siloed apart, or are there more kind of national connections and things like that?
It's a good question. It's a little bit of everything. Education journalism, like journalism writ large, has suffered a lot over the last 5 or 10 years. Advertising revenue got taken away by Facebook and Google, and a lot of people lost jobs, or a lot of teams that used to be a 5-person education team is now a 2-person or a 1-person. So there's been a downsizing of education journalism, which means people are working harder and faster and oftentimes have less time. So that's a negative trend. On the positive side, there's some brilliant and talented people in education journalism who regularly put out stories that tell me something that I didn't know or have never seen reported, and capture the public imagination. Just in the last couple of years, for example, Nice White Parents was a podcast for NPR that did amazing work. Even more recently than that is Sold a Story, another podcast that seems to have grabbed both everyday civilian readers and educators. So it's a best of times, worst of times. The one thing that's consistent and worrisome is that journalists, either out of their own motivations or because they need to prove their values to editors or to readers, the journalism is getting more alarmist. The average education piece makes it sound like the sky is falling.
Sure, yeah, like there's some chaos is sort of at your front door, like nipping at your heels,
right?
Something to get you to click on the article.
Right. And I'm not saying that there aren't bad things happening. There certainly are, and in some places they're bad. The things that we don't want to happen are on the rise. But I do wish that there was a little bit less of that everything's awful everywhere all the time kind of coverage, because I think that it alienates people. It's misleading. The bad guys don't always win. And also it suggests that bad things are happening in more places than they may actually be happening.
Well, I was going to say, one of the things that I've really like when kind of like getting your newsletter, getting your stuff in my inbox is I really enjoy seeing the kind of local stories that you find, someone writing about something specifically going on in Cleveland or in Denver or just in this school district that I have no connection to, but it's really great writing, really, really investigative. And one of the things that stands out from those like really awesome local stories is that they don't always try to extrapolate. I feel like a lot of the times when I'm engaging with some school board election coverage in particular, you'll have there are 13,000 school districts in the country. It's not very hard to find one election that kind of fits into the story that you're trying to tell. It's you could find one or a handful of them, and so you tend to see we're talking about this district, but now we're extrapolating out. But you can't always do that because there are so many school districts, but this local coverage that is really kind of informative and investigative still has an effect on somebody who is not in the Cleveland school district without needing to kind of convince me that what's happening there is coming for me next.
Right. No, I'm with you on this. The letting a local story be local is a gift, and the effort to nationalize things or to string together things and make it national, forcing, whether it's a good thing or an alarming thing, when a local story can dive in and maybe allude to a national, but not try to say what's happening here in Cleveland is happening everywhere else. That's a gift, and it happens enough that we get a newsletter out every Friday with the best education journalism of the week, but it doesn't happen as much as I would like. There's a lot of pressure on journalists to nationalize things, and sometimes it's an awkward fit.
Well, because like you said, like the gift aspect of it is being able to write a local story that would be engaging to someone who isn't directly affected by it. And if you can't find a way to do that, kind of an easy way to do that is to take it down the whole, like, this is indicative of what's going on where you are too, reader, outside of this area.
The alternative approach, which I think is just as compelling, is to say this may or may not be happening everywhere, but it's worth knowing about. People don't always need to think something's on their doorstep to be interested. And you can respect the reader by saying, this is not the usual way, or this is just happening here, as far as we know. And you can still interest them without grabbing them by the shirt and yelling in their face.
Yeah. Well, I mean, talking about kind of like specific storylines in particular, and we were talking about sort of the change in this coverage over time. You took a microscope to how schools were covered during the pandemic. And I think those conversations are coming back up now, again, strangely enough. And I found it really interesting back when that was all that anyone was talking about, whether schools would close, how viable remote learning was, because it was beyond just kind of like the stuff that you were hearing all the time. It was really diving into like the policies in these districts and how those were being addressed and looked at too. What was your perspective during that time? What did the media do well and maybe not so well during the pandemic when it comes to education?
Oh, education journalism broke my heart during the pandemic. I thought there was an opportunity for education journalism to be a hero and to help people understand what was really going on and to really inform and guide people who were scared and didn't know what was happening. Unfortunately, that's not exactly what happened. As much as I would have liked it to have. The best encapsulation of what happened during COVID when it comes to the coverage is that the education journalists were focused on what I'm going to call medical health. We're focused on infection. We're focused on transmission. And quarantines and testing protocols. The education journalists basically sort of migrated over to try to be like health journalists,
like a public health beat sort of vibe to it as well,
right? About schools, and the problem was, first of all, education journalists don't know much about health. It's not in the wheelhouse, and also it left the academic and social and emotional issues that schools are responsible for sort of underattended. So we had lots of articles about infections and transmissions and breakouts and protocols and things like that. Again, this emphasis on health and on the virus. And I get it. We were all obsessed with it, right? But what got left out of the discussion, relatively speaking, with a few exceptions, what got left out of the discussion was what was or wasn't going on academically for the kids, especially the kids who weren't in person or weren't a hybrid or just weren't coming or weren't turning on their cameras. But there were a lot of, we're now learning, like you said, that there's a lot of disengagement and demoralization of kids during this period.
Well, I was going to say, because, those topics that you were talking about as being unattended, that is really, once kind of the schools reopened and everything was back, those were the storylines that I started seeing pop up a lot. And that's why I started seeing in elections too, in school board elections, as people talking about learning loss and talking about, the more academic direct effects on the students' lives during that during that time. So yeah, it's definitely like it wasn't attended to, and then we were kind of left looking at it when there isn't so much a public health crisis to focus on anymore.
After the fact. The former NPR education journalist, Anya Kamenetz, who wrote a book called The Stolen Year, she did an interview with me sort of afterwards, and she said, we could have been a lot louder. We weren't focused on kid well-being as much as we were on health.
Mm-hmm. And I mean that kind of gets to sort of understanding that sort of that mindset. I guess what I'm left wondering now is that looking forward, does it seem like that's a lesson that has been learned, or like something that we might be doomed to repeat in a similar? I'm not trying to say that there's like a global pandemic coming up a week from now, but like that kind of realization, just like, we can be reporting on schools, right? We can be writing about what's going on in schools without actually writing about kind of the effects that these policies are having on our school communities. Right. Do you think that's something that's been taken into?
A lesson learned. I think there's some awareness. I've certainly had a lot of people talk about reflect about what did or didn't happen in the coverage. But there's also some resistance to thinking about it that way. There's a lot of sort of, we did our best. Mm-hmm. I hear the phrase, don't relitigate the past a lot, which makes me a little bit crazy. I mean, the fundamental thing that education journalism didn't do during the pandemic, and I don't think is prepared to do in a future crisis, is to interrogate really carefully the pros and cons of closing schools. Mm-hmm. There were literally less than 5 articles in the spring of 2020, just asking the hard question, is it necessary? And also, does it work? Does it work to prevent transmission when other things are not closed? School-only lockdowns, basically. And that hard question was not one that was asked, and people, parents, politicians, a lot of other people were asking it, but journalism didn't ask it enough. And that kind of fortitude, the government saying do this, or the county health office or the school superintendent saying, we need to do this out of an abundance of caution. That kind of fortitude, I'm not sure that education journalism is prepared to stand up that way as much as I wish they were.
Well, ideally that is hopefully something that is taken out of this and taken forward into future coverage. I also wanted to touch on, you mentioned the Sold the Story podcast, and one of the things I've been following closely was the Grades series that examined reading reform and how it's been covered in the media and the various policies and storylines. So it got a lot of attention after that podcast from Emily Hanford went viral, but that series itself was sort of an anomaly, right? Like, literacy doesn't typically get its time to shine and be the central focus of how we, hear about education in the news.
Right. And I was hoping that people would do, in the best sense, would jump on the literacy bandwagon, meaning education journalists would jump on the literacy bandwagon and say, hey, here's an amazing and important story. We haven't been covering it enough, and now we're just gonna ride Sold the Story's coattails. Instead, there has been a weird reluctance or discomfort around covering the story. It's the biggest story out there right now.
You had a piece where you interviewed one of the subjects from the podcast about sort of his experience after being on the pod, or I guess like lack of an experience after being on the podcast, and kind of the coverage in that respect. And a part that stood out for me with that was there was a part where he mentioned feeling like a conspiracy theorist for kind of talking about something that he didn't really see anybody else talking about. And I never really thought of it in that lens of like, once you realize something, if you don't kind of have this sort of universe of a conversation happening, you can sometimes feel very isolated in those conversations.
Right. And I think that to some extent that happens to the journalists who've been pushing hard on covering the literacy story. Where is everyone else? Why is everyone being so slow or hesitant? There's some reasons for this that I can guess at, but I really would wish that would be the literacy and re-engaging students in attending school. I think those are the two big issues, and there's been an insufficient response so far, according to me at least. There have been a lot of one-off articles about literacy. One-off is great. But what you really need in situations like this, whatever the topic is, whatever the beat is, you need a drumbeat. You need people coming back and pursuing the next steps of the story. For example, Columbia University just dissolved a big literacy program recently. There's been very little coverage in the 3 or 4 weeks since then. It's an obvious story. It's not the only story, but it's an obvious story, and I wish that people would go for it.
Well, and I know that kind of from our perspective as kind of a group that likes to try to distill things in a neutral way and kind of get that information out there, those kind of recurring storylines that kind of continue on and the conversation evolves, that sometimes makes for some of the most, I would think, sort of like engaging or helpful content for our readers to kind of engage with, if you have kind of like a string that you can follow rather than just kind of like pop-ups here and there. We actually this jogged my memory to an edition of our newsletter, Hall Pass, that we sent out in May. We put a question in there asking people, readers, to tell us whether they thought their district was using the best possible reading program, and we got like a bunch of responses from community members, from school board candidates, from teachers, from school board members, all talking about this, and not just like saying like yes or no, but like talking about this with like detail behind it and kind of experience behind it as well. So it's interesting to see like a storyline where there's clearly people out there who have thoughts about this, but kind of not having like a place to go for it.
Right. No, there's a lot of interest out there in the real world. And by the way, Hall Pass is a great newsletter, and I'm a big fan. So thank you. Thank you for doing that. Oftentimes, the news media is out in front of a story. Sometimes it almost seems like they're trying to make something a story that may or may not be as big as the media is making it. In this situation with literacy, the people's interest and activity at the district and school and state level is actually way out ahead, and the journalism is just trailing.
Well, so when I was thinking about this, I had a question in mind as to like why did this kind of topic have its sort of like time in the sun, earlier this year? Why did it capture the minds of people engaged in education, but also just people writ large? And my where that went was, oh, well, there's been all this hot button coverage of these more kind of, red meat topics that maybe that has like primed the audience to be more receptive to school stories coming out of school boards. But it sounds sort of like in the course of this conversation, the interest might just be the fact that it's something that people are experiencing. They don't need to be primed to caring about what's going on in school board elections as much as it's just, this might just be an issue that's playing out in their lives that they are, aware of and affected by.
I think that's right. People were ready for a quiet but very important story that they hadn't heard about in a long time. Literacy wasn't getting much of any attention for 5 or 10 years before Emily came along. And the podcast had the quality of a true crime podcast. Mm-hmm. Like there was a mystery. It's an obscure mystery. It's got a history. How did this happen? It had it really grabbed people who may or may not have experiences with literacy instruction, may or may not have a kid in school, or may not have struggled to learn to read. one of the things that made it stand out was that it was crafted in such a way to just maximize curiosity without resorting to hyperbole. And a brilliant piece. I'm so glad that she did it. What an effort. And, that series has gotten every award and accolade out there, except for a couple. But it's gotten so much attention. I'm really happy that it happened. And I wish people would follow along and tell a story. It's also a good reminder that you can make an education story if you craft it as a mystery. You can get someone who doesn't give a hoot about education to listen.
I was just about to say, I don't have kids in school. I don't have any experience with literacy reform or any of that, but it was engaging. It's a shout out to podcast producers everywhere, including the ones listening to us right now, that what you do is great work. And can make these things, like, you can just, the format of how you tell the story can be the hook that brings people in and gets them engaged with this topic without, like you said, without having to, what we were talking about earlier, make it seem like the sky's falling at the same time.
Right.
As for a little sneak peek for what readers can expect coming up from you all, the grade is going to be focusing on parent-centered education coverage in October. Now, before we jump into that, I'll say that when I heard parent-centered education, my mind, and probably the minds of many people, went to the ever on vogue parents' rights discussions that we have been hearing a lot about over the past few years. But I'm sensing that this might be a little bit different from that. So what is the difference there for people who, when you hear parents and education, tend to think of the political storylines that we've been hearing recently?
Sure. That's a great question. The chronic or sort of structural issue in education journalism is that the journalists tend to talk to educators, administrators, school system heads, advocates, talk to a lot of people, and sometimes tend to struggle to find everyday parents and kids. I always say it's the education beat, not the educator beat, to remind people that people who teach the kids and who run the schools and fund them, all important parts of it. But at the end of the day, it's a parent and a kid, or parents and kids who are sort of most affected most immediately. And so I've been, for the last several years, trying to get people to include or feature parents, or even come up with stories that are based on parent interests. Because what parents are interested in and what school administrators are interested in oftentimes aren't the same thing. And I'm not saying one is more important than the other, but I think they both need to be in there. I'm not, just to clarify though, I'm not trying to encourage more coverage of parent activists or people who are extreme at one or the other end of the spectrum. Those people are good at getting attention. They get a lot of it. That's fine. It's the everyday parent and the everyday kid whose interests and experiences should be attended to and depicted in journalism, because they oftentimes get left out. They're like the quiet kid in class. The teacher is praising the brilliant kid and telling the disruptive kid to come back to the classroom. There are a lot of parents who have everyday concerns. One of them might be, is my kid learning to read? One of them might be, are my kids' scores and actual knowledge as good as the grades they're getting? A lot of kids get A's and B's, but it turns out that they don't actually know as much or can't do as much as the parents think. There are a lot of everyday parent issues, and I'd like people to pay attention to them.
Well, and that they kind of, when you're talking about topics being attended to or skimmed over, maybe this is sort of like one of those lesson learned moments that we were just talking about earlier. The focus, it feels like, just kind of in terms of the coverage that I come across most often, it feels like a lot of the focus, especially now, the school board elections are coming up, is like kind of on the political beat, the election beat focus of it, which obviously doesn't leave a lot of room to talk about things beyond what's going on in the election.
Right.
Yeah. So
here's a mundane but really central issue going on in schools right now is whether to or how to constructively restrict cell phone use. Right. Cell phones have a value, and they also have a distraction quality. And a lot of schools are trying to figure out what to do, and schools are making, with varying degrees of success, they're trying to figure out how to let kids be modern day kids and let parents have contact with their kids as much as they want and still have some learning happen. That's not a political issue. It could become a political issue, but it's not currently a political issue. It's not a sexy issue, but it's deeply important because the schools that have succeeded in figuring out how to engage kids and restrict cell phone use reasonably are just much more calm places, and kids have a better chance of learning at them. But that's the type of thing, the story that gets drowned out by the politics.
I was going to say, because I think I might have even mentioned it. I talk about school boards a lot on the podcast. I know that one of the things that has really stood out to me with those, what we called conflict topics in the past, just the hot button, the mask requirements, the race and education, the sex and gender, those what has always stood out to me with those conversations is that they have to do with stuff going on in the schools, obviously, right? Whether or not kids have to wear masks in schools, what's in the library. These are all conversations that, affect schools.
Sure.
But the topics themselves tend to feel like they're talking about something more than that. Like schools are an avatar for a larger cultural conversation.
Right.
But then these topics like reading reform and absenteeism and cell phone usage, those are topics that are about schools and like totally contained to schools. Right. You're not going to see someone running for the U.S. Senate with a spot on their election issues page talking about cell phone usage in schools, the same way that you might see a spot about pandemic responses on their issues page.
You put it really well. The issues become proxies for culture wars or for politics, and there's a place for that, but there's also an important place, I'd argue, for non-political, non-proxy education coverage.
Well, and then also, I mean, you mentioned, but before we jumped on here, that you had a chance to interview our CEO at Ballotpedia, Leslie Graves, recently about what role, if any, these school board elections play. And the thing that has stood out to me the most, listeners are aware that we got comprehensive school board coverage in 10 states this year. 3 of them have already happened: Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and South Dakota. And in those 3 states, what really stood out to me doing this comprehensive coverage, where we're covering every school board election, was that like a strong majority of these elections are totally uncontested. Like nobody's running for them, or like one person is running. I mean, there were like 20 races in Oklahoma where nobody ran, and it just created a vacancy that the school board themselves had to go out and find somebody to fill that vacancy. It was 79% of the elections in South Dakota were canceled, 79% in Oklahoma, 58% in Wisconsin, which is like, a battleground state. Yeah. Wisconsin is a state that people pay a lot of attention. I'm from South Dakota, so I can say that people don't really pay attention to South Dakota that much, but people pay attention to Wisconsin, and 58% of those elections were uncontested. So it does seem like kind of a dichotomy in how these elections are covered versus what is actually happening.
Right. And where it's happening, it's happening. I'm not saying that people are making up controversy or conflict. Mm-hmm. It is happening, but it isn't happening as broadly. I don't think it's happening, thanks partly to the research that Ballotpedia does. I don't think it's happening in as many places as people think it's happening. My understanding is that the outcomes aren't as universally in favor of the hard right position as the media would lead you to believe.
Oh yeah, I mean, we had a little while ago we had a professor from Wisconsin, Paul Russo, was on, and she conducted research into school board elections in Wisconsin and like the Republican vote share versus Democratic vote share and how that affected the outcomes, whether or not these kind of issues popped up and which of those candidates won. And it seemed to kind of fall along party lines where like, if you've got a school district in a county that voted for Joe Biden, chances are that school district is going to elect people who are, more to the center or to the left than you would elsewhere, and vice versa. I mean, in November of last year, when we covered all these conflict elections, we found that 75% of the candidates who won, who supported things like mask requirements or diversity, equity, learning plans, they won in districts that were in counties that Joe Biden won. And then inversely, or I guess conversely, 60% of the candidates who opposed those topics won in districts and counties that Trump won. So, it's not like a silver bullet sort of thing from what we've seen. But you are right, where it's happening, it is happening. I mean, we're following endorsements now very closely because candidates have kind of gotten a little bit more vague in the language and the verbiage that they might use to kind of lay out their stances. And these endorsing groups, they are, still quite active, but it's not at all universal. Like they don't go to every district and kind of weigh in on every race.
Right. And also, as you pointed out, and again, this is such valuable work, and I wish it were picked up more by media than it has been. I hope that changes soon. The outcomes often match the local politics. Mm-hmm. And if we believe in local control, we've got a highly decentralized school system. Local communities get to pick school board members that match their interests and values. Mm-hmm. There are very few, you correct me if I'm wrong, but there are very few situations where a super progressive school board has come in and won over a conservative district, or a conservative slate has come in and taken over a wildly liberal kind of place. But that's the impression you get from reading the stories the media puts out, which is they're coming for your school next, as opposed to your school is going to do what your school district is going to do what your school district does generally politically. Again, there's some exceptions, but the vast majority seem like they're aligned with the politics of the area.
But it gets back also to like, there might be an instance where a very progressive group has taken over a school board in a conservative district, or a very conservative group has done so in a progressive district. That might have happened, but it gets back to the whole like 13,000 school districts, aspect of how education is like set up in our country, is that that might have happened,
and how long
it has happened a lot.
And as Leslie points out, how long is that slate going to last, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes people are in for a couple of years, and then things revert back to their usual form. It's fascinating and a little bit horrifying, frankly. I think that if you ask the average person, just like the average person thinks that schools are dangerous and the scene of frequent gun violence.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Which is a media creation. I think that people think that the high conflict school board elections are happening almost everywhere, and that the conservatives prevail, not just in conservative parts of the country, but in moderate or liberal ones. And I don't think that's right.
That's kind of like, that was all when we first started covering the conflict elections back in 2021. It was just to kind of like, catalog how frequently is this coming up? How frequently are candidates talking about these things, or how frequently are these topics coming up in conversation or in debates and things like that? And now that we're able to do this, like one of the things that always was hard when we would do that coverage in particular is that we had kind of a glaring blind spot in the form of like all of the districts where we didn't get like a Google News alert, or we didn't find a hit on that front, like what's going on in those districts. But now with this comprehensive work, it has been really helpful to look at these things en masse, and you still see those little spots that really pop up and kind of get very energetic, very a lot of activity, a lot of they occupies a lot of space. Some of that is also due to kind of the nature of how we go about getting a lot of this information.
Sure.
One of the things that we've encountered a lot is that it's very hard to see what's going on in the school district in a very rural district because a lot of those candidates don't have Facebook pages, they don't have campaign websites.
Right.
The amount of their activity is captured in maybe a once weekly paper county periodical that also doesn't have a website. It's hard to know what's going on there, but we at least have a little bit of a better way of looking at, I guess, like the blank space and being able to like actually have a shape to it rather than just be like, we're looking at this small segment and we don't really know what's going on everywhere else.
Yeah, no, it's a really valuable and like you said, challenging thing that you're doing. I hope, and if I can be helpful in any way, but I hope that one of the national educational reporters will want to grab a hold of some of the work that you're doing and saying, hey, things may not be quite the way we think they are when we just look at the high conflict districts.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited for November in particular is that, we've got, I think, Colorado's on the docket, Pennsylvania's on the docket, Virginia, Ohio. So a lot of states, I mean, like Ohio and Pennsylvania and Colorado, when we first did our conflict elections in 2021, that coverage, that's where the activity was, we're in those states broadly. So it's going to be really interesting seeing there what's being contested, what's not being contested,
right.
And being able to get that idea just to at least provide that context, like even just like have as like an aside to give a reader the context of like where all of this happening. But that's, like you mentioned, that's the hardest thing is that there's a lot of districts out there to kind of get to the point where you have that context. Well, I mean, the state level elections that we've got coming up this November and next November, of course, already starting to take up more and more of the attention out there when it comes to politics. From your perspective, what are some of the most important education storylines for our listeners to keep an eye out between now and then? We talked about some of like the policy topics that you'll be focusing on. Was there anything else sort of looking out into the future that you've got on your horizon?
I think that we've touched on most of the topics that I think are important: literacy, attendance, some of these core things that affect kids and their futures. The other thing that people can do, which is important, is they also can read education news skeptically, right? Mm-hmm. Just because it's in the Washington Post or the New York Times, don't turn off your brain. And if the story seems like it's trying to scare you, look past that and see if what's being reported is actually as frightening as the story is trying to make you think. If the story has a really strong good guy, bad guy, right, wrong kind of a feel to it, ask yourself some questions about that. And then when it comes to the coverage of politics, politics and education is where I come from. I'm not against, but the coverage is often not as savvy as I'd like it to be. Not in the smug DC pundit kind of sense of savvy, but it's in the sense of understanding why. Let's say, for example, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, he's making a lot of announcements. He's introducing and signing a lot of things. Those stories are relevant and should be told, but it's important to understand why he's doing that.
Yeah.
Right? Where the political necessity is, or what the motivation might be. I always tell people, remember The West Wing, the TV show from a while back? I always tell people every time a elected or appointed official goes out and talks, there's a meeting that person had with staff talking about whether or not to do it or why to do it. And a good story, a good piece of journalism explains why Gavin Newsom is doing what he's doing. It takes you into that room with the staff saying, oh, we need an event this week because of X and Y. And a good piece of journalism, which is what I hope people will look out for and value, will tell you, it'll cover the event, but it'll also tell you why the event is happening. And a superficial or cartoonish bit of coverage will just say, so-and-so said this and so-and-so responded back. There'll be like a he said, she said quality without some of the backstage stuff, which is what journalism can do.
Sure. I mean, that back end context that I guess makes it feel more like there's that string to it that you can follow, rather than it just being this thing that kind of appears in front of you and then you have to digest.
Take us exactly right. Take us backstage, because if you're just going to report what the person said and what the other person said in response, we can get that ourselves. We don't need journalism to, those campaigns will pump out all that stuff on their own. What journalists can do that no one else can do is take us backstage, whether it's backstage on the politics side or backstage inside of the school. Those are the two unique values of journalism. Social media and the campaigns will take care of the rest. Oh yeah,
that's wonderful advice, and that's what we'll ideally be here to help distill, and what people will be seeing when they come and sign up and start reading stuff from the grade as well. Well, thank you so much for your time today and for your expertise. This was a great conversation, exactly what I was looking forward to.
Oh, good. Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate what you guys are doing and great questions.
Well, and for our listeners, you can learn more about Alexander's work at the link in our show notes. We will be back next week with another episode. Make sure to subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Doug, and thanks for listening.